Your poetry exam is on the 23rd of May, and there are two sections in this exam. So section A will be an unseen poem, a poem that you will never probably have seen before, and section B, you'll be answering two questions from the clashes and collisions part of the anthology, if that's what you've been studying. The unseen poem, you will need to use spirit to answer that question, and we'll go through that in this tutorial now. Section B, you will also need to use spirit, so even if you've missed a lesson or you're not sure about the poem in as much detail as you could be, then you can still use spirit in the exam to work out what you could say about it. The first question will always choose one poem from the 15 that we will have looked at, and you'll be doing an essay on a particular theme. The second question, you have two choices and you only choose one question. You're given a poem to compare to the one you wrote about already, or you can choose a poem to compare to the one that you wrote about already. So it's really important that you do know all of these poems in the anthology in as much detail as you can. I'd advise looking at the actual exam paper, which you're all given a copy of in the first lesson that we had, and just making sure that you know what the setup of the exam paper is like. Okay, so some of the important things that you'll need to do if you are aiming for a C or above in this exam. If we look at the C grade, we've got to make sure that you are using quotations from the poem and you're linking them to the theme that you've identified. So if you think the poem is about conflict, or it's about race or discrimination, prejudice, whatever you think the theme is, you've got to be picking up the quotations to link to that theme, link to that question. You need to make sure that you're identifying poetic features, so identifying things like similes or metaphors, onomatopoeia, and thinking about how that supports the point that you're making, what's the effect of using those techniques. If you're aiming for higher than that, aiming for the B, A star, then you're starting to think about why these features, why these devices are significant, why the writers use them, what is the effect that it has on the reader. You might also consider how does the effect of these techniques, how does that link to the theme of the poem? And it may be that there is some kind of historical or literary context and significance to the poem. So for example, we've looked at Belfast Confetti, so you would need to talk about the conflict in Ireland at the time and be able to link what the poet is saying to what was going on. You would also, for the higher grades, consider alternative explanations or alternative interpretations. So that's why the 7 stages and using the 7 stages is a really good way of answering this question. If you can do the 7 stages well, then you'll be able to achieve the B, the A star. These little pictures are here just to remind you that in poetry there is no right answer, so you can blag it. You can talk about your own ideas, you can talk about how things link together, and it's essentially trying to use the evidence in the poem to support what you're saying. And as long as you can do that, you can say whatever you want. Okay, so spirit is going to be really, really important for you to remember. Make sure you revise these key terms, you know what they mean. So when we're talking about structure, we're thinking about the stanzas, how many stanzas does the poem have, what kind of line lengths are we looking at, how long are the sentences, are there anything to do with the presentation of the poem, can you see enjambment where the lines run on from each other into the next stanza, why might that be happening, are there any questions that direct the shape of the poem, and what is the order of the ideas, so what does the poet talk about first, what's at the end, what maybe do they hold back and not tell you until the end, and why do they do that? Poetic techniques, we're thinking about our devices, so things like alliteration, onomatopoeia, repetition. These are all basically language techniques that we've done time and time again when we've looked at Mice and Men. So you'll be looking at particular words. Are there any connotations that you can link to particular words? Is it standard English? Is it non-standard English? Why does that matter? Punctuation choices as well. You might notice something about the way the poet's constantly using questions or maybe pauses and thinking about why that is. If we look at imagery next, we're thinking about the metaphors, the similes, personification, the five senses, anything that the poet is doing to paint a picture in your head of what is going on. The rhythm and the rhyme, are there specific rhyme schemes? Is it A, B, A, B? Is it A, B, B? Is there no rhyme? Why is that? What are the patterns that you can see? If there's no rhyme, is that because the poet's trying to make it more realistic? Are they trying to tell a story? Think about the reasons behind things and the effect of them when they're used. The ideas in the poem are obviously really important. That's the first thing you should be looking for. So thinking about, what is the poet actually trying to say? Are there any key messages that the poet's trying to give? What are the themes? What are the main ideas that this poet is talking about? And then T is for tone and voice. So the tone of something, is it serious? Is it sarcastic? Is it humorous? And the voice, particularly, of the person, the persona who is speaking in the poem. What kind of persona is it? Is it different to the poet? Is it the same as the poet? Is the poet pretending to be somebody else? And we're thinking about the feelings and the mood that's created in the poem. Who's speaking? Whose point of view is it from? And also, how does the mood change throughout the poem? And you're going to be using all of these things to analyse the unseen poems, but also the poems that we're looking at in class as well. So section A, you've got 45 minutes. The whole exam is an hour and 45 minutes, so this section you get 45 minutes to look at the unseen poem. And it will always be the same question stem. So it will always say, explore how the poet presents her or his ideas about something. And you will be told to support your answer with examples from the poem, so it's just reminding you that you always need to include those quotations. So if we look at this example question here, this poem that we're going to look at as an unseen poem is one in your anthology, but we did do this in class as an unseen poem, so we're going to pretend that we've never seen it before. So the question says, explore how Hannah presents her ideas. Remember, we always use the last name of the poet. Presents her ideas about the persona in the poem. So the persona in the poem is the person who we see things from their point of view. So the person whose point of view we're seeing all the time in the poem. Now, if we look at the poem, and you've all got this in your anthology, and we think the first thing we need to do is read through the poem. And sometimes you might need to read the poem through more than once, because you might not get all of the ideas, or you might not understand it to start with. So you read through the poem as many times as you need to work out what's going on. And using Spirit, you then start to analyse and annotate the poem. So in the exam, you're writing things down in the poem, you're underlining, you're highlighting anything that you need or you think is useful. It's a good idea to always start with ideas, because that's the thing that you need to understand first of all. So what are the ideas in this poem? So if we look at each stanza, we can find out different ideas that we've learned. So we know that it's some kind of school context. We can see that the teacher who's speaking, the persona in the poem, is making students write about a holiday. So we said in class that this is making us think maybe it's a primary school. The children, although the boy is described as being bright, the spelling is quite a simple spelling, and he can't spell this correctly, or he's not willing to spell it correctly. There's some confusion and misunderstanding between the teacher and the student, and it's not until the end stanza that the teacher realises that actually the student's dad has died, and it's that missing E that eventually gets them to realise that. Now, in your essay, you would start off talking about the ideas in the poem, and then you would move on to whatever part of Spirit you think is most appropriate. Because the question is asking us about the persona, it was a good idea to try and link our essay to this question particularly. So the main thing that we need to think about now maybe is the tone and the mood, and also the voice of the person in this poem. So if we have a look at the questions in the poem, there are a lot of questions that the teacher asks all the way through. You can see those highlighted in yellow. And perhaps we could say that the misunderstanding is shown through those questions. The teacher doesn't understand what has happened, what did this student's dad do, and the short sentences as well helps it make it sound like the teacher either doesn't really care about this or is getting quite frustrated that they don't understand what this student is doing. There's lots of imperatives, words which are commanding, imperative verbs. You make them, or never mind the bell, we're going to stay here until you finish the work. So there's lots of commanding words which also get you to think about the teacher and what kind of teacher they might be. The teacher seems quite negative, so though this boy is bright, he says he's finished, there's no change, you count their words and all the assignments are complete. There's nothing in here that's positive or that's giving a sense that the teacher is a caring kind of person. It's all very superior sounding. The teacher sounds quite condescending, like they are superior and they're in charge. You who can count and spell seems to make it sound like the teacher is feeling superior because they're the one that knows things and the students are learning from them. After you've thought about the tone and voice, you can choose something else in spirit to look at, and it might be that you look at the poetic devices because they might be telling you how the poet has got you to think about the persona in a particular way. So what kind of words are being used for effect, or what kind of things does the poet do that make you feel a certain way? We could look at the personal pronouns in this poem. The poet talks about they and you and we, so we've got all of these personal pronouns, and we could say that maybe that's to make a sense of distance between the teacher and the student. We have to work out ourselves as the reader who they and who you is to start with, so it's not immediately clear who are being talked about. We learn then that they are the students, and it's interesting that the second person is used here, so you make them write about the holiday, you count their words, you who can count and spell. So we can see that as maybe the poet wanting us to see the students or see the context from the teacher's point of view. By using the word you, we kind of put ourselves in that teacher's shoes as well, which makes it even more effective when we get towards the end of the poem and we realise with this change of perspective here what's actually going on. And we maybe feel a sense of guilt or a sense of shame that the teacher hasn't realised, but also we haven't realised as a reader what's happened to this child. We've got simple sentences, very short sentences. That's not a question, never mind the bell, we stay behind until the work is done, which helps to create that sense of distance as well, helps to make it sound very short, maybe make the teacher sound very strict, and there's that sense that it's not a very cosy or fluffy kind of classroom, it's quite rigid and ordered. It's quite a straightforward way of telling this kind of narrative, but at the end we actually realise that the true meaning of the poem and the emotions behind it are very complex. This student's dad has died in the holiday and we're not aware of that particularly until the ending. You've got a sense of irony as well because the teacher's given the student an E for their assignment and you read the line again, it's just one E short, and you realise that the student has spelt that particular word wrong, and that's why the teacher has had this misunderstanding and hasn't understood what's happened. We can look at the structure of the poem as well, and we can see that there's 4 stanzas, each got 4 lines, so it's a very ordered structure. The rhyme scheme, away, holiday, not what, we can see it's A, B, so you can see that all the way through the poem. And again, that rigid structure perhaps implies that the persona is very strict, they like order, they're very organised, and perhaps we can see that that might be why they don't have any sympathy for somebody who can't spell, or they're not willing to understand and feel empathy with the student. The standard English shows us maybe that it's quite a formal situation, the teacher's maybe very formal with the students and perhaps doesn't engage with them on a more personal level. So when you're looking at structure, you need to think, how does that relate to the poem itself? How does that help you to see the ideas behind the poem? Recognise how many stanzas there are and the line lengths and things like that, but make sure that you link it in to the ideas themselves. So if you think about now how you would write up your notes, you've got the question here, explore how Hannah presents her ideas about the persona. So everything that you're writing in this mini essay has to relate to this question. You need to use your analysis using Spirit to write the answer, and we're going to try and use the 7 stages to develop each point that you make. To start with, you should talk about the ideas, because it needs to be clear to the examiner that you know what's going on in the poem. So if you can read this, and you might have to pause the screen and read through the answer that I've written here, you can see that this is a clear explanation of what the poem is about. It's got the main ideas in there, the main themes. The word successfully, Hannah successfully puts the reader in the context, shows that you are evaluating how good this poem is, so it shows your opinion. You need to use words like this, successfully or cleverly or clearly, and we'll talk about this in more detail, but that shows that you're evaluating and thinking about your own ideas. So if you want to pause that and just read that through. And if we move on to the next part of the essay, talking about tone and voice. So again, if you want to pause this and read through it, this might just be one of the paragraphs that you would use. You might add another section afterwards about tone and voice, but you can see how I've made a point, I've given evidence to support it, and then exploring the language in more detail, saying that it's an imperative and why that is being used, what the effect of it is, and then the big chunk here of explanation is about the effect on the reader. So it's using the 7 stages to try and develop these key points and try and extend them in more detail. So again, if you want to pause that and read it through. Talking about poetic devices in this paragraph. So again, you choose a device that you want to talk about. You could have chosen to talk about something different, perhaps the questions, and I might want to do that as well, perhaps if that's something that I want to do. But this one is focusing on the personal pronouns and why they're being used. You notice that all the way through there's lots and lots of quotations being added in, embedded into that answer. So again, if you want to pause and read it through. Finally, the structure. I've not written too much on this, so that might need to be added in a little bit more detail. But again, that links into the ideas about the persona, and everything that I'm saying is linking back to the question that I was asked. So, some top tips for answering on the unseen question. Read the poem carefully and try and work out what the ideas are. And again, don't worry if you have to read that poem 2, 3, 4 times before you really understand what's going on. Remember that nobody probably has seen this poem before, so the examiner is not wanting an answer that is in their head already. They're wanting to see what you can do, what ideas you have about the poem. You're not going to be wrong, you just need to find the evidence to support what you are saying. Second thing you need to do is analyse the poem using the appropriate parts of Spirit. Now sometimes you might not find anything that you can say about the structure. Sometimes it might not be clear if there's any imagery. So you need to choose the bits that actually work with this poem. And as you're going through it, you need to annotate and say what's happening in different places, so that when you come to write the essay, you've got your notes to do that. 3, focus on what the question is asking, so reread the question, work out what it's asking you, and link your answer directly to this. There's no point just waffling on about anything, it has to be answering the question. Answer the question then in a mini essay where you're focusing on one part of Spirit in each paragraph. So it might be that your first paragraph is always about the ideas in the poem, and then for one poem you might think, well actually structure is really important, that really helps to answer this question, so that could go next. In another poem it might be that actually there's loads of poetic devices that really help to answer the question, so you do that one next. So you have got to choose and make the decision yourself which bit is appropriate to talk about. Use the 7 stages to develop your answer in more detail, so think about some of the question stems that you can use to do that. And then finally, check that you've used enough quotations from the poem and think about the effect of those quotations, the effect of the language, what you could say about that.